All right. Thank you for having me. The conversation has been really interesting so far, and I think relates to a lot of the kinds of things that I'm going to talk about, which is not entirely copyright, but I think that's a good place to start. In some ways, copyright has been sort of the OG content moderation. And one of the reasons I was mentioning this yesterday on Twitter, one of the reasons that I went to law school in the first place was that I read code when I was a master's student. You can thank Amy for that. And I remember at the time being super fascinated by the idea of how copyright in particular was intersecting with the really cool things that people were doing online. Because at the time I was writing a lot of fan fiction. And I was thinking, why is this legal? This is so interesting. And when we think about copyright law and some of the really important parts of it, like, for example, fair use, which I'm going to talk about, these laws were written a long time ago. Fair use was codified in the US in the 70s, and a lot of the discussion around that time was, around things like photocopiers. And copyright as a legal concept was, for a long time, mostly just relevant to big copyright owners and artists and lawyers, and wasn't something that everyday people had to think about, which is not the case now, of course. And content creation, which is not necessarily new. Like, we're thinking now about people posting on Facebook and creating YouTube videos or this sort of thing, but also people have been writing fan fiction. Well, you can go all the way back to Sherlock Holmes, but you can think of Star Trek zines in the 60s. Remix as something that is relevant to copyright. It's not new, but digital technology and the internet has made it a much bigger deal than it used to be. So my dissertation research was all about why copyright is hard online. A lot of this has to do with things like misunderstandings of fair use, and poor information being shared online, the fact that social norms conflict with platform policies, conflict with the law. Also did a study of DMCA anti-circumvention, which showed how the ways that people expect to use technology does not fit with actual laws. And in the course of this, something that was coming up over and over and over had to do with remix and what people were allowed to do versus not do, which again is not something that everyday people had to grapple with, before, say, the past 20 years or so. In the United States, fair use is a legal doctrine that governs how we can reuse content. There are similar laws in other countries, fair dealing in the UK and Canada, for example. And this becomes really, really important when you think about how much content is constantly reshared and remixed online every day. And this is also a fairly case-by-case, context-dependent legal doctrine. And as was pointed out yesterday, sometimes moderation is not super good at context. So this becomes a little bit of a problem. So think about, for example, fair use. And I hope this works. Let's try. Let's see what YouTube has to say about fair use.
Oh, Russell, your reuse of Lumpy's content is clever, but did you get permission for it? Mashups or remixes of content may also require permission from the original copyright owner, depending on whether or not the use is a fair use. In the United States, copyright law allows for the fair use of copyrighted material under certain limited circumstances without the prior permission from the owner. Under the law, determinations of fair use take into account the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the work used in relation to the work as a whole, and the effect of the use upon the potential market for the copyrighted work. Other jurisdictions may have similar copyright provisions protecting fair use or fair dealing. If you're uncertain as to whether specific use qualifies as a fair use, you should consult a qualified copyright attorney.
All right, so the lesson from this, which is from YouTube's copyright school video from 2011, which you are basically forced to watch if you get copyright strikes on your account. fair use will literally crush you. And if you are a non-commercial remixer making YouTube videos, then you probably should consult an attorney before posting your content to YouTube. And the very first interview study that I did as part of my dissertation, and so I believe this was about 2011, one of my interview participants gave me a quote that I still think about often and really influenced the course of what I continued to examine. So she was a fan bidder. She created remix videos, essentially. And she told me that she only posts her videos like under password protection on her personal journal because she was so afraid of YouTube taking down her videos because of copyright violations. So this had happened to her before. And she said, she felt really confident that she wasn't actually violating the law, but clearly YouTube didn't respect that. And she was afraid of getting her content taken down. And this made her sad because she wanted to share her content with more people. And I heard many, many stories like this over the years. So chilling effects, as was implied by the title of this talk, is the inhibition of legitimate exercise of rights or expression because of threats of legal sanctions. So we often talk about this in terms of free speech, like not saying something because you are afraid that you might get in trouble. But this also would apply to something like not choosing to create remix videos or to post them on YouTube because you're afraid that it's copyright infringement and you're going to get into trouble. A few years ago, following up from all that work that I did as part of my dissertation, we conducted a survey of fan creators and asked some fairly simple questions. And one of the open answer questions was, have you experienced copyright issues related to your fan works? And if so, what were they? And unsurprisingly, a lot of these had to do with content takedowns, and a lot of them had to do with YouTube. And in particular, issues around content ID and the appeals process with content ID. So let's also see how YouTube explains counter notices for a content ID takedown. So here you have a video, it is automatically flagged as having copyrighted content in it, and then you're told, well, you can appeal this.
If someone takes down your video by mistake, or as a result of a misidentification of the material to be removed, there's a counter notification process for that. You can send YouTube a notice that there was an error. But be careful. If you misuse the process, you could end up in court. And then you would get in a lot of trouble. That's how the law works.
You could get in a lot of trouble. That's how the law works, is the epitaph in my dissertation. So this is an example of a type of automated content moderation and the appeals process for that. So this is under DMCA 512 in the United States, which is about notice and takedown, which is basically if a copyright owner says that there is copyrighted content on your platform, you're not liable, you just have to take it down. And then there's a way for people to appeal. And YouTube has operationalized this with content ID, which is actually not an official DMCA takedown, but sort of a level that comes before that. And the Copyright Office a couple of years ago did this big report on DMCA 512, looking at the problems of DMCA 512, because clearly it's not completely working. What's going on here? And they talked a lot about all the problems with it and do not mention at all non-infringing users. Like, people who are having their content wrongfully taken down due to DMCA 512, not mentioned at all. There's even this note that like, no potential solution will please everyone, but everyone just means copyright owners and ISPs, even when non-infringing uses are mentioned in this report, it's in the context of, oh, the burden to the service providers in dealing with this. But I heard from a lot of people who are ostensibly non-infringing users who had a lot of problems because of content takedowns. Again, these are not all official DMCA takedowns. Some of them are content ID, but it's also very hard to know the difference of what's happening on YouTube. So a lot of people think that they are being given a formal legal takedown when actually it's just internal YouTube policy. And the copyright school video is, of course, a little bit silly. People are forced to watch it. But the actual sort of policy and language is pretty similar in terms of like the discouragement and making it sound kind of scary. And a lot of people talked about this. This is scary. I was scared my appeal would fail, so I didn't do it. I was too scared to fight it. A lot of people also talked about sort of the burden of going through this process or not knowing about it at all. I didn't realize that I had recourse. I just complied because this further hassle was unwanted stress. A few people also mentioned, I thought about fighting it, but I didn't feel like exposing my identity, which I will mention again in a moment. So part of all of this, again, lots of stuff about copyright and non-infringing uses over the years. The main things that I see is that chilling effects occur when the rules are confusing. So if judges and lawyers are going to argue about whether something is fair use or not, how are you possibly supposed to know? You should consult a qualified copyright attorney. I am a qualified copyright attorney, and I can't even tell you half the time whether something is actually fair use or not. Also, when policies are scary and when the appeals processes are arduous. And then again, back to this idea of things that make them arduous, privacy issues. So I've just started to, I've begun to embrace this label, but I am also a content creator. I did a video essay on YouTube last year about fair use and got a content ID takedown for it. Yahtzee, yay, I can see how this works, went through the entire appeals process. And one of the things that really struck me was that a content ID appeal, again, it looks very similar to a formal DMCA appeal, and you're required to give your full legal name in order to do this, which a lot of people who are anonymous online for lots of legitimate reasons do not want to do. So that's one reason that this process can be arduous. And again, this relationship between content ID and the DMCA, et cetera, is pretty confusing. There's this great report from Catherine Trindacosta at EFF, and this magical diagram of how it all works, and it's just as bad as you might think. We also see other kinds of examples outside of remix videos. You might have heard about police officers playing music so that it can't be posted, that the video of them can't be posted on YouTube. This blew up last year with this particular example of a police officer playing Taylor Swift music and saying, I'm playing this so you can't post it on YouTube. And this idea of like weaponizing automated content moderation. Because again, not very good at context. An algorithm will never, I'm going to say this very confidently, an algorithm will never be able to determine fair use. People can barely determine fair use. It is not a thing that has bright line rules and therefore can't be coded for. And so this is always going to be a problem. So now I've talked about copyright a lot, and this problem of the lack of context, issues with arduousness of process and false positives is also something that we see in a lot of other contexts. And I've been thinking about copyright a lot for 15 years. I've been thinking a lot about TikTok for about a year. And I've seen some parallels in thinking about content moderation there. I mean, I've also looked at content moderation on Reddit and Discord, but this is very interesting. I'm in the middle of an interview study of TikTok creators about content moderation. This is a self-selected sample of people who wanted to talk about content moderation, but they all think it's completely broken. Like the people that I've talked to, it doesn't, like they just think it doesn't work at all. Like it's not taking down the stuff that it should take down. And what I mostly heard about was stuff getting taken down that shouldn't be taken down, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about here. Now, let me preface this by saying that we only see content moderation when it's broken, right? Like you don't see when videos get taken down when they should be taken down because they're not there. You see videos that you think should be taken down and are still up. And you see or hear about when your content or someone else's content was taken down when it shouldn't be. So, this is actually a big challenge, I think, in general, and all the ways that we've talked about people's reaction to content moderation online. I think it's important to remember that as well. You might have heard examples of content moderation mistakes on TikTok. This was a big one last year. And probably just like a word filter, word dictionary issue, which was that bios in the creator marketplace were being flagged as inappropriate if they had the words Black in them. I am a Black creator, for example, were being flagged as inappropriate. This was a specific example for the creator marketplace, but this is sort of a known problem that I've heard from a lot of people in terms of there are certain things that I cannot talk about. There are certain words that I cannot use. And there's this Washington Post article not long ago dubbing this as algo speak. The terminology that people on TikTok use to avoid using words that they think are going to be moderated. So lay dollar bean instead of lesbian, or unalive instead of kill are two examples. Also, people will lexical variations, white, Black, etc. A lot of people have talked to me about this in the context of hate speech and racism in particular, but really lots of kinds of marginalized voices on TikTok. And I've been starting to think about this in terms of a particular problem that I've sort of identified as a problem and do not know what the solution is. So let's take hate speech as an example. A false negative for a hate speech detector would be, this is racism, and we do not know that it is racism, and therefore it is staying up on the platform. False negative. A false positive is, this is not racism, but it's getting taken down because the algorithm thinks that it's racism. And a common type of that, and I've had many, many people give me explicit examples of this, is that to an automated system, someone talking about racism might sound an awful lot like racism, right? This is not a surprising problem to the people in this room. The problem here is that both of these are harming the same people. Either you are seeing racism or homophobia or anti-Semitism, and that is harming you, or you are the person who is harmed by racism or homophobia or anti-Semitism talking about it, and then your content is taken down, also harming you. No matter how you calibrate it, more false positives or more false negatives, you're harming the same people. And when content is taken down when it shouldn't be, what does that look like? And I have to say, I was actually laughing a little bit when Patty was talking about like clear, specific being given clear, specific reasons why you broke a rule. One of the ways that this comes up is because reporting is often weaponized on TikTok. So we see like mass reporting, coordinated mass reporting, and it's causing content to be taken down. And when that happens, you definitely don't know what rule you broke because you didn't break any rules. And it's not helping you out that the messages are basically, this was a community guidelines violation. Apparently I didn't save my screenshot, so I only have a screenshot of one of my videos where I was complaining about this. 10 minutes, thank you. So this is an example of a content violation that I got on TikTok. I've gotten a bunch. But I can tell you that like, I don't really break the rules because I'm the like buzzkill lawyer that reads the terms of service. Content removed for violating our community guidelines. What was your content violation? Community guidelines. That's it. No more level of detail. Sometimes there's like one more granular level, like pop up one level, maybe like harassment and bullying or nudity or whatever. But very often it's just this. You have violated our community guidelines. So a question here then is, how are you supposed to follow the rules if you don't know what they are, even after you break them? So what happens after you get a community guidelines violation? In that case, it was a comment. And actually, let me show this to you again if you didn't notice. A lot of people are noticing last year that people were getting comments removed because they were sourcing, like leaving a link to, say, a scholarly citation in the comments. Now, the assumption is that this was probably spam filters. But was anyone told that? No. So after this, you can basically click to appeal. Here's an appeal button. I've been told that once upon a time, TikTok allowed you to like write in why this was not a community guidelines violation, and they have since taken away that. So it's just a one-click button to appeal. What happens after that? Who knows? I would like to think that maybe appeals go to a person, but this is very unclear. And then one of two things happens. One, you get a message back that says your content was restored and you still don't know what you potentially did wrong. Or you get a message back saying, we reviewed your appeal and your content was violating, so it's staying down. And you still don't know what rule you've broken. This has come up a little bit in context of transparency. We were just talking about that earlier in terms of shadow banning, or like yesterday, the issue came up of like match lists or word filters, and why, you might not want to have a list of all the words that are banned because people will just use lexical variations, etc., which is indeed a very difficult problem. However, it's also a problem that if you don't know what rules you're breaking, you can't not break them. This has come up a lot in terms of accounts getting banned. There's a huge number of like unban people campaigns. This example on the right here is an autistic TikTok creator who is I cannot even imagine any rules she could have possibly broken based on my consumption of her content. This happens all the time. Sometimes it's mass reporting, as I mentioned. Sometimes it's algorithmic mistakes. Who knows? But none of these people ever are told why they were banned. Another kind of lack of transparency and sort of remedy is that when sounds on TikTok are muted, you actually aren't even told if that happens. This is a copyright related issue. One of my favorite TikTok creators, the trans handyman, had used a background sound in a whole lot of her videos. And suddenly they were all completely muted because of a copyright takedown, presumably of the original sound. But the people who use that sound aren't notified. And it resulted in like hundreds of videos of educational content of hers being muted. And she didn't even know about it until one of her fans told her. So all of this leads me to sort of one final point. If I had to pick something to change, wave my magic wand, make something happen differently, both when it comes to copyright and when it comes to some of the problems that I've seen on TikTok and related platforms, it's that if moderation is imperfect, which it will be, especially automated content moderation, like there's no way it's going to be perfect. You're going to have false positives. You're going to have false negatives. Since we know that's the case, appeals processes are extremely important, and they have to both be not scary, and they have to be fair, and they have to be as quick as possible. I recognize that this is a challenge, but I think that it's something that we should be thinking a lot about when it comes to content moderation. And I will leave you with that. Most of the work that I pointed to is linked on this web page about my lab's work on governance. And I would love to take some questions.
Hello, Professor Fiesler. This is Joan Feigenbaum. Really fascinating. Thanks very much for this presentation. So I have two questions. One very general and one very specific. So my general question has its roots in when I first became aware of digital copyright issues, which was in the 1990s when I participated in the National Research Council's CSTB Digital Dilemma report. I don't know whether you've ever seen this Digital Dilemma report from the NRC, but I mean, this was, as I said, this was the 90s. In fact, it was written right before Napster, so it's sort of a time capsule. And it was extremely clear to me right then, it was the very first time I ever thought about these issues, that US copyright law is just totally inappropriate for digital content. I do not believe that we could have a system in which it was pretty easy to just publish copyright works and, derive some of the benefits as as a copyright owner, and also be a consumer of copyright content and somebody who wants to make fair use of copyright content and derive some of those benefits. I think that it's all of the problems that you've detailed here, I think were foreseeable. There's tons of other problems. I think that the whole structure of copyright law, where you have this logically incomplete system, and you have these exceptions, like the fair use doctrine and the first sale doctrine and everything, is just and the fact that everything is so focused on copying in particular, which is like breathing in the digital environment. I mean, copying goes on all the time. I said from day one, this is unworkable. We have to rewrite copyright law so that it's true to the constitutional goal of, promoting progress in science and the useful arts, but doesn't just tie everybody up in this kind of like rigmarole that you've so aptly described. And I've been saying this, for 25 years, and I've gotten nowhere. All of the copyright scholars, mostly lawyers, in fact, exclusively lawyers, whom I've come to with this idea, just say, no, you can't do that. You can't just, that's not the way law works. You can't just throw it over and start from scratch. What's your reaction to that, to my impression that it's great that people like you think through all of this stuff so carefully, but I just am totally pessimistic that all of your deep thinking is going to really work, given what our laws are and what our digital technology is. Am I too pessimistic?
I mean, I also think that there are large parts of copyright law that are really broken. It's hard to find good solutions to some of them. I think it's good that, like, for example, for DMCA anti-circumvention rules, the fact that there's like an exemption system and it's updated every 3 years, that's good. I have a lot of complaints about fair use and the fact that it's so hard for people to understand and it's so inconsistent, et cetera. But it's also hard to know what it should be instead, because bright line rules would also have a lot of problems. And at least with it being on a case-by-case basis, it can have the sort of context-dependent analysis that I think that it needs, particularly given changing technology. I do think that one of the problems with copyright is that again, like, consumers as stakeholders are largely ignored. Copyright lobbying is like big copyright owners, not remixers, except for the Organization for Transformative Works. And we do not have a large voice, we have a small voice. And like Lawrence Lessig stopped doing copyright advocacy and completely switched to campaign finance reform, because there's no point in trying to change copyright when politicians are all,
and of course, there's no point in trying to change campaign finance either. So I think Lessig might not be the right guy to follow. But and I'll say, like, especially at the time I was writing my dissertation, a lot of people would ask me, like, oh, are your papers going to have implications for policy sections instead of implications for design? Like, are you going to try to change copyright law? And I got to tell you, maybe this is the pessimist in me, but no, like, the law is very slow to change. There are a lot of barriers to changing the law, but I think that I can have a bigger impact potentially on trying to influence platforms. Like, I don't know if YouTube would like to listen to me, but I would be happy to tell them how they should change things within the constraints of the law. And so I've been working on, that sort of thing, platform policy, platform design, et cetera, and how those kinds of things could potentially help. Okay, so my very specific question is, so what are you a fan of? What do you write fan fiction about? If it's something you're willing to share. I realize there are some things you might be a fan of that you might not want to tell us, but go ahead.
Not a lot these days. I am not a secretive person about my fan history. It started off with Star Trek. I wrote Star Trek fan fiction on Usenet in the 90s and ran Star Trek role-playing games, which is actually how I originally connected with Amy, because I was like, people are doing cool things on the internet. And then I wrote Harry Potter fan fiction for a long time, but I probably haven't in about 10 years, to be honest.
Thanks, Casey. That was great. I'm Gavin Sullivan from Edinburgh Law School. I just wanted to pick up on the kind of final comment you came to about creating fair and not scary appeals process and how essential that was, and invite you to elaborate in a bit more detail about what you think that might look like. And I'm conscious here of, the emerging, the kind of sizable body of literature that simply says, well, given the size and scale of automated content moderation processes, individualized remedies, which you were kind of pointing to, simply just aren't feasible beyond the kind of box-ticking appeals process that you kind of, quite rightly criticized. And we've got, for example, with the Facebook Oversight Board, a kind of glimpse of what a more detailed review process might look like with respect to individual pieces of content. But in between the Facebook Oversight Board and the box-ticking process that you described, I wonder where you see a kind of realistic or the best avenues to push for something that's much more meaningful. And I'm particularly interested in this because the processes that you're describing in the copyright context are mirrored and replicated in many ways in the extremism and terrorism space as well. The same technology and the same problems. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I wish I had like concrete sort of answers. So starting with copyright. Again, this is a fairly small thing, but I have no idea why Content ID counter notices on YouTube require you to give your real legal name. DMCA counter notices would, because that's a legal requirement, but most content takedowns are not DMCA. It's coming through via Content ID. So that's just one example. And also, like right now, when you go through it, it's like, oh, you want to say it's fair use? Are you sure? Are you really sure it's fair use? Like, here are a bunch of reasons why you might think it's fair use, but it's probably not. Whereas instead, that could be framed as, here are some reasons why this might be fair use. Like, the problem is that YouTube is not incentivized to help the remixers, right? Like, they are much more likely to face consequences for copyright owners being mad than like, you know, some chilling effects on some like fan vid creators. And so discouraging people from fighting it makes a ton of sense from that perspective, but it's just exacerbating this imbalance of power. On TikTok, for example, the fact that that you don't even know which rules you broke is ridiculous, because they know, right? Like, they know what box was ticked. Like, clearly my comment getting removed was some kind of spam filter. TikTok has some of the most detailed and honestly good community guidelines that I've seen on any platform. Like, they recently made some changes to like clarify that like dead naming and misgendering is a form of harassment, and some specific things around self-harm. Like, they're very specific, but they're still not telling people what community guidelines they're violating. But the scale issue is absolutely a problem. And I don't really know how to solve it, except I guess Amy's point from yesterday that like, given unlimited resources, this is not a problem. And should TikTok be putting more resources into human moderators? Yes, with the caveat of the trauma problem. Actually, Catherine Trindacosta, who did that thing about Content ID, gave a keynote at CCW a couple of years ago, and I asked her a question afterwards, which was like, so what do we do? Like, what about the human moderation problem? She's like, well, when it comes to copyright, the trauma problem is not as much of an issue, right? So like, having a bunch of human content moderators deciding whether something is fair use is actually less of a problem than violent extremism, for example. So just a few half-baked thoughts. I could talk about this for an hour.
Hi, James Grimmelman, Cornell. I had a question about something I've been wondering about for years, which is the one particular form of copyright disclaimer that people use on materials they post, along the lines of, I don't own this. And the relationship between people's understanding of owning something and what they're allowed to do with it seems to be one of those very deep folk beliefs that misaligns with the world of copyright, where it's all about what do you have permission to do, what's licensed, what's fair. And people are resorting to this very broad, very monolithic concept of who owns it. And then I'm just trying to think about what the copyright system can do to be more respectful and more integrated with people's intuitive understandings of it. How does the concept of ownership fit into those? And is that a place where platform education could be doing a better job?
Great point. The I don't own this thing is like a staple for fan fiction, even for 20 years. And had a lot of people talking to me about that. In fact, a lot of people in the first study that I did thought that like attribution would make something fair use. Like, well, I said who the owner was, so why is this not okay? So I did a study a few years ago that was published at CHI in 2020 about DMCA anti-circumvention exemptions, and it was analyzing the reasons that people were saying they should have there should be exemptions, and it largely came down to, and these are things, right to repair and that sort of stuff, and it largely came down to like, I own this, why can't I do what I want with it? And it really highlighted how DRM in particular is a usability problem. Like, people have these very strong intuitions about how you can use technology, and then the law totally breaks it, which is why it's such an interesting HCI problem, is like, why can't I use this the way I want to? And the answer is, sorry, the law. I mean, what do we do about it is an interesting question. When I was writing my dissertation, I was talking a lot about ways that platforms could have better education and scaffolding. Like, what if YouTube had a fair use wizard, kind of like Wikipedia does, and that sort of thing. But yeah, yes. Oh, and actually, I'll give you a little piece of hope, actually, on this point. When we talked to people in the survey where we asked people about their copyright experiences, and in particular, people were talking about takedowns, there were a couple of people who were like, I did a counter notice and it worked exactly as it should have, and my video got taken back up. And they both mentioned that they had gotten direct help from the Organization for Transformative Works. Like, I emailed OTW and told them I got a takedown, and they told me what to do, and I did it. So, OTW is legal committee is 5 people. We don't really scale, but it does suggest that there's something to be said for education. And anecdotally, in my research, people who are more confident about their understandings of fair use are much more likely to fight it, and to appeal and that sort of thing. And so I think that says something about the appeals process, but also that we can educate people about what they're allowed to do in the first place, so that people also know that the difference between what ownership means and that sort of thing.
Okay, Dan, if you can ask your question, and then we do have one more question in the room, but let's try to, if we can, finish by 10:40 if we can.
Sure.
So go ahead, Dan.
Dan Lena from Northwestern. I'm glad you mentioned the point, Casey, again about educating users. It caught my attention when you said that an algorithm cannot determine what fair use is because humans can't even figure it out. So if we're telling end users to go talk to a lawyer, well, they're probably going to get something like, well, it depends, right? And something that's not even very satisfying if you can get to a lawyer. But I spend a lot of my time thinking about how can we develop technologies that can help end users understand the law and advise them in these situations. And so I wonder, can't we develop algorithms that would do at least as well as the human lawyers would do? And then probably maybe a lot of these cases are a little bit clearer, help educate people. So develop even its expert systems based on some of the checklists we see now, and then figure out ways to augment that with machine learning. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of hear, the law is a mess. That's another thing that needs to be addressed in this area. But even with the law as it is, couldn't we create algorithms, different tools at end users to help them better understand the law and what they ought to be doing?
That's a great point. I mentioned, I was thinking of, this was a while ago. I assume it still exists. Wikipedia had a sort of fair use wizard where you uploaded a photo and it was like, do these things apply? That sort of that sort of thing. And something like that could potentially be automated. Could they at least do as well as humans? The question is which humans? You should, I mentioned on my first slide about some of my dissertation work, the bad information thing. I spent hours and hours and hours and hours reading forum postings and of people talking about copyright and the bad fair use takes. Someone posted on YouTube's help forums, I made a remix video, here's could this be fair use? And someone responded and said, basically, fair use is not a real thing. It's like this unicorn. So, people are getting bad information from non-experts is one problem. I mean, could an algorithm, use some sorts of common fair use things? I mean, yeah, if you were willing to create bright line rules that might not be accurate, but might give you some sense, I think that would be potentially useful. I think the important thing would be that it would need to have explainability around why it's making these decisions and why it might be wrong. Because if you're going to do, sort of like a 10% rule or something like that, or you're looking at like the transformation of an image or that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, it might be a better than nothing kind of thing, as long as people weren't relying on it too much. But I do think it can also be an educational tool. I mean, you could see running something through it and it tells you why it might be fair use or not in an educational kind of way, like amount of substantiality and and that sort of thing. So it's an interesting idea. And I know I noticed there's some more questions in the chat on Zoom, and so I'm happy to answer the questions in the chat there too.
Hi, Casey. I have a question. This is Aruna from MIT, and I used to be a big Wikipedian, and one of my pet projects was to collect Indian classical music and like increase the number of recordings on Wikimedia Commons. And I wasn't dealing with fair use because Wikipedia puts things under a Creative Commons license, so people can kind of download it and then use it commercially. The problem that I was dealing with was more nuanced in the sense of some of these recordings were still under copyright from decades ago, but in like certain countries. So the nice thing with Wikipedia was that I think it would list which countries things were out of copyright and you could still use it. But my question was more around, have you seen people like work around copyright violations in certain countries by using VPNs or so in like TikTok? Like, do they also differentiate, I guess, copyright violations between different countries and therefore allow you to access content if you're, seemingly from a different country?
Yes, people certainly do that all the time. I mean, I'm thinking in particular of people who will like VPN into like, I don't know, BBC iPlayer or like VPN into Netflix because it has this one show in this country and not in this country and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think people do that, and honestly, the differences in international copyright law like also complicates all of this. But I'll also add something based on what you just said, because this is really interesting. So 2 students in my class this past semester, graduate students, did projects on basically like people talking about copyright online. One of them was a subreddit for Twitch, and basically saw the same kinds of things I saw in my research, which was like people getting content takedowns and being confused. But someone also did the Village Pump on Wikipedia Commons, which is people talking about copyright on Wikimedia, and same stuff. Misconceptions about the law, confusion about the law versus Wikipedia policy, some indication of chilling effects and that sort of thing. So you actually see this in a lot of different contexts and not just like remix videos.
Okay, great. Thank you, Casey. Thank you, Casey. That was excellent. One more applause.